situations. So Apocrypha, small a, comes from a Greek word meaning hidden. That doesn't help a whole lot. The term Apocrypha, capital A, notice the difference, refers to a collection of books written in the intertestamental period and going a bit into the first century. In general, these books appeared in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, known as the Septuagint, but not in the Hebrew versions of the Old Testament. We're going to talk more about this in a moment, but therein is where the argument starts about whether they should be treated as authoritative or not. The Septuagint, which is sometimes represented by an LXX, and we'll talk about why in a moment. What does LXX mean in 70? So somewhere along the line, 70 is going to be a significant number when we talk about the Septuagint. It's a term applied to a Greek translation of the Old Testament started in the 3rd century BC. Why did we need a Greek translation of the Old Testament in the 3rd century BC?
Because everybody didn't speak Hebrew.
Jews had been spread all over the Mediterranean. They had been Hellenized. We're not talking about Helen of Troy or my best friend's wife. Hellenization refers to when Jews are in Alexandria or there are different places around the Mediterranean, and they kind of become incorporated into Greek culture, Greek life. So they're known as Hellenized Jews. A lot of those Hellenized Jews couldn't even read Hebrew anymore. So they had to have a translation that was in a language they could read. So that's one of the reasons to write this wonderful translation. There was another reason too, and we'll get to that in a moment. There are books that appear in the Septuagint, but not in the Hebrew Masoretic text. And those books form the core of the Apocrypha. So how did this happen? So you have the Masoretic text. You take your Old Testament and you open it up and you look at it. In general, certainly if it's a Bible translated before 1965, but even post-1965 Bibles, what you're holding in your hand is known as the Masoretic text. The Masoretic text is a official Hebrew source document for the Old Testament that was approved by Jewish elders in the 1st century AD. So for a long time it was considered to be the source. So when Christians put together their Bible, they used the Masoretic text. Sometimes it's referred to as the MT. So the Septuagint comes along. Septuagint does this wonderful Greek translation of the Old Testament. But guess what? A lot of other books have been written in the intertestamental period that weren't around when the Masoretic text was put together. And those books, the people who did the Septuagint decided to include them. They're cool. Hey, First Maccabees, Tobit, Judith, cool. We're going to put them in. And this sets the stage for the great argument. Do we consider them to be authoritative or not? I think Septuagint should be considered authoritative because the source documents for the Septuagint were not written in Greek. They were written in Hebrew. And how do we know that? Because when they found the Dead Sea Scrolls, they found ancient versions of books of the Old Testament, and when they looked at them, they found out that they matched the text in the Septuagint, not the text in the Masoretic. But we go on. So why should we consider the Septuagint or not consider it to be authoritative? Majority of the quotations in the New Testament from the Old, so when the New Testament is quoting, as it says in Isaiah, a voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare ye the way for the Lord. They're taken from the Septuagint. They're not taken from the Masoretic text. Well, that's kind of interesting. That's why some of you may notice, if maybe you've done Disciples or some other Bible study where you go through the whole Bible, you ever notice that in the New Testament, when it's quoting the Old Testament, and then you go back and check the same verse in the Old Testament, they don't look exactly the same? You ever wonder why? That's because the Old Testament is based on the Masoretic text, the New Testament is based on the Greek translation, the Septuagint. Biblical manuscripts found among the Dead Sea Scrolls indicate that the differences between the Septuagint, LXX, and the Masoretic text are because the Septuagint is based on a different Hebrew source than the MT. And this is at the core of the argument. This is something that Augustine didn't even know. Augustine had no idea this was true. But it's key. Because the reason some scholars, including Jerome, poo-pooed the Septuagint is because until 1948, the only sources we had for the Septuagint were Greek sources. So they said, well, this is a translation. You should never consider a translation to be authoritative. So the fact that there's differences in the Septuagint Old Testament compared to the Masoretic Old Testament, well, that's because those translators ran wild. In the Septuagint, they just did what they wanted, and so we shouldn't take that as authoritative. And then they found the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they found all these ancient books of the Old Testament, and the additions or the changes, the differences between the Septuagint and the Masoretic text. They found them in these ancient Old Testament texts. And so the reason the Septuagint is different than the Masoretic text is not because it's a Greek translation and they ran wild. It's because they were using different ancient Hebrew source documents. Why would you have books of the Old Testament that had differences between them? Well, we don't know for sure, but one possibility is that different sects of Judaism back in that time had different sources for the ancient scriptures. Does that happen today? Well, yeah, the Roman Catholic Bible has 12 books in it that the NIV doesn't. Eastern Orthodox Bible has 16 books in it that the NIV doesn't. So we have the same thing today. So the same thing could have been true back then, that they, maybe the Essenes, for example, had their own ancient Hebrew source documents, and those were the ones that were used for the Septuagint. So anyway, this has elevated the authority of the Septuagint in the eyes of many biblical scholars. And that is why today, especially in Isaiah, because that's the one that's affected the most, in your NIV or your NRSV or whatever you're using, if you look in the book of Isaiah, you'll see a bunch of footnotes. Footnotes will say something like DSS says or Septuagint says. And in those footnotes, they're showing what the differences are between the Masoretic text and the books that were found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Augustine, or Gene's not here today, so I guess I don't have to say or Augustine. So we'll keep it we'll keep it Americanized today.
Lydia's here. She's represented.
I'll stay on.
Okay, St. Augustine in American, or Augustine if you're British. He believed the Septuagint translation was divinely inspired. He said, for the Septuagint translators are justly believed to have received the spirit of prophecy, so that if they made any alterations under his authority and did not adhere to a strict translation, we could not doubt that this was divinely dictated. So Augustine didn't know about the Dead Sea Scrolls and the separate sources. Augustine knew there were differences in the Septuagint from the Masoretic text. So how did he explain it? Well, translators must have been divinely inspired when they made the changes. I think that's kind of cool. And therefore, we find that the apostles justly sanctioned the Septuagint by quoting it as well as the Hebrew when they had these proofs from the Scriptures. So once again, when the apostles quote the Old Testament, they don't quote the Masoretic text, they quote the Septuagint. And Augustine is saying that he thinks that was a reasonable thing for them to do.